We're going to be starting our last panel, which is about the legacies of service. So all of what we've talked about has culminated not only in impacting how Chinese Americans have contributed to the war, but then at the other end, when they come back, how the war has impacted the Chinese American community. And that's what this panel is all about. So I want to introduce Major General Bill Chen, who will be walking us through this last panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Legacies of Service. I'm going to make a few overview comments, and then I'll be followed in sequence there. I think all of you know Roger Dong and Wayland Liu locally here. And, of course, you know Monty and then John Yuen. I think you'll be introducing himself a little bit, too. But the first question I want to ask is of Monty. Why is it that when I was on active duty as a young lieutenant, young captain, that there wasn't a Chinese canteen for me to go to? Yeah, where? You weren't in Chinatown, bro. No, but before I went to Vietnam in 1966, I was a young captain, and so I went to the Defense Language Institute at Monterey. I used to come up to San Francisco on weekends, but I never met any girls. Okay, what I'd like to do first is summarize the major contributions of our World War II veterans. And of course, you know what the environment was pre-World War II and immediately into World War II. Many of the Chinese in America and many of the Chinese Americans lived rather isolated in the Chinese communities, the Chinatowns across the country, or they were spread out across the country in rural areas. But the first major accomplishment and contribution of Chinese American veterans was that they made known to the American people who the Chinese Americans were and their capabilities. Number two, in spite of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they volunteered and they served. They served with pride, and they were proud to be Americans. They demonstrated their skills, their competencies, their loyalty, and their patriotism. And of course, for those of us that followed, they paved the way for future generations here in the United States. They opened up opportunities for all Asians and Chinese Americans to be a part of mainstream America. And most of all, while I'm not a historian, all of you would probably agree that the first major accomplishment of Chinese in America was building the Transcontinental Railroad. The second major contribution is all the contributions of our World War II veterans. And so they continued what I call the legacy of progress in each generation in terms of enabling us to live the American dream. Okay, down the bottom is a quote from the public law that approved the Congressional Gold Medal for Chinese American veterans of World War II, that they demonstrated highly uncommon and commendable sense of patriotism and honor in face of discrimination. Now, all of you know that the World War II generation is our greatest generation. But where you read the books about the greatest generation, Chinese Americans were not recognized and were not honored. And so perhaps with the award of the Congressional Gold Medal that we will finally get that recognition. Now, as part of the review committee for the Congressional Gold Medal and part of our questionnaire that we asked registrants to fill out, they have an opportunity to write a few words Mostly it's coming from the daughters and the sons and the next of kin concerning their family. What they consistently talk about is that our veteran forefathers came home, but in many instances, they never told much about their experiences in the war. The other part was that the war opened up their eyes, opened up their perspectives of the world, something that they didn't have before the war. They returned home and they worked hard. They took advantage of the GI Bill and the War Brides Act, and we'll hear about that. But they kept working hard. They raised their families so that you, being the daughters and the sons, can say that you went to college, all of you got your education, or you got the benefits of your parents and their use of the GI Bill to open up businesses, etc. And so you have an improved quality of life as a result of the hard work and sacrifices of your fathers and their other family members. Now here's a picture of me in 1943. I was about 4 years old, and I have 4 titles on this chart, and all 4 titles apply. Okay, the first title is The Spirit of World War II. What is the spirit of World War II? Well, we heard Monty talk about that earlier in terms of the home front. So here it is, my mother in her World War II hairdo, and who dresses up a 4-year-old? My mother. Okay, so what is she? She is the proud spouse of a U.S. Army Air Corps captain, and she dresses up her son in uniform. That's why I call this the spirit of World War II. The other title I have is Living Our Dreams, okay? How does this young kid at 4 years old grow up and some years later become a major general in the United States Army? It's part of living our dreams. You know, it takes hard work. You have to be lucky. You have to work for the right bosses and, of course, do a good job. So that's my living our dreams. Now, the one I like best is Only in America. At the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad in Salt Lake City, I was one of the guest speakers, and one of the statements I made was, only in America could a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker become a major general. Now, to the audience there, I gave a vision and a motive. I said, let's arbitrarily pick a time frame like 50 years from now. So that would be the 200th anniversary. Wouldn't it be nice at the 200th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad that somebody, it won't be me, would say, only in America could a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker become the President of the United States. So, that's America for you. And why is that? It's because of the freedom, it's because of the rules of law and the sacrifices that our World War II veterans did. Okay, let me turn it over now to Roger. So, Roger, it's all yours.
Thank you, Major General. I think I'm really pleased to have met General Chen for the first time in my life, and also Monty. For this audience, I think the spirit, background, and energy they put into this effort today is truly spectacular. Please give them a hand. Now for the boring part. Normally I give long, boring speeches, but today it's short, boring. War Brides Act was completed just 4 months after the World War II ended. And why did that happen? Well, as most of you probably know, a lot of bad things happened. Laws and acts were established to make our life very difficult. In fact, as people have mentioned, the Exclusion Act was intended to eliminate us by attrition. If we had Black Hawks instead of walks, we would have been treated a lot different. But we were not a threat, so they said, let's ease the Chinese out of here. We'll just not allow them to be citizens, and maybe in 50 years there won't be any left. But anyway, on December 28, 1945, Congress had a guilt streak. They recognized that we had thousands of Chinese who served loyally, and they owed us something. And therefore, the first of the War Acts, 1845, was intended to allow us to bring our wives, fiancés back to America. That was the beginning of the repopulation of our population. Today we have 5.5 million Chinese. If it weren't for this, who knows how few would have been left? Because after Exclusion Act was in 1862. 60 years later, we had World War I. By that time, there's nothing but old people left. If that persisted, none of us would be here today. In fact, I'm a war bride's baby. We Chinese and many Asians reward people who are well educated. So we're going to do that right now. We're going to have a little fun right up front. What was HR 4747? If anybody can answer that question, I have 4 crispy $5 bills for you. 4740. You're guessing. It's not. It's actually in 19th century. Okay. Close, but not right. Next. Okay, that was for $20. Next. Okay, we'll give you a hint. We'll take $5 for $15. 1875. HR 4747. What was that? Hey, one educated person, 3 Lotus. You taking me out to dinner tonight? Got $5 left. Okay, that was the Page Act, and very famously, it was in February 1875 when a Republican, one of the first Republicans in California, 1875, named Horace Page, pushed through Congress and got the president to sign in 3 weeks the Page Act. Who was affected by the Page Act? $5. There you go. Okay. Hooray. My $5. Sorry, I'm out of money. We won't be giving them any more today. Next. What it was is the first federal immigration law in the United States signed by President Ulysses Grant that banned women from coming to America. And the reason was because they were declared immoral. Now, there were no Chinese men who declared this. So we know it's somebody else who declared that all Chinese women were immoral. Next. The other law that affected the predecessor, again, as mentioned, the Exclusion Act of 1882, that was signed on May 6, 1882 by President Chester Arthur. This was the first immigration law targeting a specific ethnic or national group. We were the lucky ones. Then as now, business loves cheap labor, but labor hates cheap labor. And you think about that's true because business likes cheap labor. That's how they make more money. Unfortunately, the competition, when they lay off other citizens, our other citizens get mad at us. Today, as you know, this thing against China for many years now, the anti-feelings about the Chinese. You know, there are a lot of millionaires made in America because they took advantage of cheap labor in China. It was a business decision. If the labor had been $2 or $3 in Canada, they would have gone to Canada or Timbuktu. But China had $2 to $3 labor 20 years ago, and so business made a business decision, and therefore we have a lot of people mad at the Chinese today, although it was not the Chinese who caused the problem. And of course, at the time, the real goal was ethnic and racial cleansing by attrition, And this, I have to be fair, we blamed a Republican up there. A Democrat named Dennis Kearney pushed through in 1882 the Exclusion Act. Once becoming law, Chinese immigrants challenged the Exclusion Act in court, but to no avail. A lot of people don't realize that 6 companies and a lot of organizations spent a lot of money with lawyers fighting in courts, but unfortunately, they were not successful. Now, there were exemptions to this Exclusion Act that would allow diplomats, teachers, congressmen, and clergy to immigrate with minimal restrictions. Otherwise, if that hadn't happened, by 1943, there would have been 0 Chinese here. Now, this set of immigrants would bring wives and families, and that's why we had 15,000, 20,000 volunteering. Another act that was very nasty to us was the Immigration Act of 1924. That banned all Asian immigrations, including Eastern and Southern Europeans. So we weren't the ones picked on. The famous statement at that time was from President Calvin Coolidge. He says, "America must remain for Americans." What does that mean? Quotas were allocated based on percentage of immigrants already in America in 1890. The intention was to reduce quotas of non-white immigrants. Next. Now, between 1882 and 1941, immigration laws limited Chinese families so that when World War II began, there were only a limited number of young Chinese immigrants to join the military and fight for America. More than 12,000 male Chinese, other people talk about other numbers, but the source I got this from said 12,000. Monty and I discussed it. It's probably close to 15,000 male Chinese who volunteered or drafted into the military. And then in 43, yeah, I'm 40, I'm sorry, I don't have any money for that. In 43, Congress passed the famous Magnuson Act, which would shut down the Exclusion Act. Unfortunately, as most of you know, the quota was still 105, so to be eligible to become a citizen and become an immigrant is very, very slim until the 1865 Immigration Act. I'm only off by 100 years. What do you want? I'm 75. I get a break once in a while, don't? Now, there were very few Chinese females to become wives and mothers. Non-Chinese females who dared to marry Chinese men could jeopardize their American citizenship. Most people didn't realize that. If a non-Chinese man or woman married a Chinese person, theoretically, they could have lost their citizenship. That was never challenged in court because that's probably unconstitutional. Okay, to reward the Chinese immigrants for their loyalty to America when we were at war, 4 months after the end of World War II, December 28, 1945, Congress passed the War Brides Act to allow alien spouses, natural children, and adopted children of the United States Armed Forces to enter the United States. That's the beginning of the repopulation, okay? With the repealing of the CEA in 1943 with the Magnuson Act, the War Brides Act of 45 had the greatest impact on Chinese immigrants. A follow-on to the Brides Act in June of 46 allowed Filipinos and Indian immigrants, and lastly in 47, the wives and fiancés of Korean and Japanese immigrants were allowed. We were never taught this in high school. I learned this a few years ago, the War Brides Act. Okay. Total outcome of the World War II Acts of 45 to 48, more than 100,000 wives and families entered the United States as a result of this legislation. For the Chinese, who were the greatest beneficiaries of the War Acts, this was the great facilitator for the repopulation of the race of Chinese people in America. As I said, census in 2017, 5.5 million Chinese with Chinese blood. Some were mixed. Based on the, okay, and at that time it was 1.5% of the total population. Hooray! And we're almost through. Hooray, one more, and this one is one major beneficiary. There's one War Brides Act. That was me. 73 years ago. And I'm here today because of the War Brides Act. Hooray! That's it.
Good afternoon. I am Wayland Liu, and I'm here to speak about my father, Din Lu Lee, and how the GI Bill impacted him and his future family's life. But first, I would like to provide a brief history of his life before he served in World War II. My father was born in Longbin Village, Toishan. He was the middle child of a firstborn son to excuse me, to date, the actual date of my father when he came to the United States was a bit sketchy, but I was told he arrived around age 13. I was only able to confirm that he arrived here at the age of 18. So it's a little bit fuzzy because the size of this photo was smaller than a passport photo. Like many Chinese descendants whose parents immigrated from Toisan, many used paper names. My father's was no different. This is partially due to the reason why it's taken so much time for me to gather this information. My father's birth name was Wei Kun Li, or Li Wai Kun, but he was also known as Din Lu, Edwin or Eddie Din Lu, and Din Lu Li. He arrived on U.S. soil and was processed through Angel Island. He was the paper son and used the name of Din Lu at that time. For many immigrants processed at Angel Island, this was a very dark period. My father never spoke of his time there. I learned about this from my mother. Before being allowed to enter San Francisco, immigrants were asked to detail questions to verify that they are the family member. Those who failed the interrogation were not admitted into the country. Fortunately, my father, at age 13, passed the interview and was able to enter San Francisco. Dad resided with my grandfather, who lived just a few blocks from where we are today. He went to Francisco Middle School and worked as a house servant in the Presidio Heights area. Prior to his military service, he attended Samuel Gomper School, trade school here in San Francisco, for continued education and apprentice as an electrician. Additionally, he worked for 5 months as a ship fitter's helper at Bethlehem Steel. A layout man helped journeymen place and hold templates or patterns to mark all fabrication points according to specs. Shortly after that, turned 22, he was inducted into the United States Army. Even though the Chinese Exclusion Act was not yet repealed, many born of Chinese ancestry enlisted to serve without hesitation. Many weren't citizens, but had blind faith that the United States would change and prove itself to be the land of opportunity. Thankfully, they did, or history would be different today. With his trade school education and work experience at Bethlehem Steel, Dad was able to continue his military education at the Air Mechanics School at Shepherd Field, Texas, where he completed courses in structure repair, cooling systems, fuel and oil systems, functions of airplane instructions, and engine flight casts. With his education and training, Dad qualified to become an airplane maintenance technician. For 17 months, he was with the 407th Airplane Service Squadron in China and India, where he removed, disassembled, and made major overhauls of engines in addition to other inspections. He then became crew chief for 24 months. So these are some of the photos of him during his military. The 407th Air Squadron serviced aircrafts during the war. That was also qualified as a marksman carbine, which was probably an important qualification to have since they were likely targets of the enemy. After the war, Dad returned to China to marry my mother. It was an arranged marriage. They were married by the American Vice Consul in China. They traveled to America on the vessel SS General W.H. Gordon. So there's the manifest, where the arrows are pointing is their name on the manifest. Initially, my parents had limited financial resources. They shared a flat with another couple and had used household furnishings. They did have a new bed, a wedding gift from my maternal grandparents. Shortly after settling in, Dad took advantage of the GI Bill and enrolled at Heald's Business College here in San Francisco. Upon receiving his business credentials, he worked at Royal Pine Market on Pine Street to learn the grocery business. 6 years into their marriage, my parents purchased a grocery store named College Market in the area commonly known as Cathedral Hill today. At the time of their purchase, the area was not gentrified. For the next 25 years, they operated and upgraded the business to accommodate the changing environment. It was a corner grocery store, but spacious enough to provide groceries, sundries, liquor, cigarettes, fresh produce, meat, fish, and poultry, a deli counter, and offered neighborhood delivery service. My father had the business acumen to realize the neighborhood was slated for redevelopment, and he embarked on a store remodel by expanding the produce section. He also purchased a store-length freezer to accommodate the growing working class community. If you are in the area of Ellis and Franklin, you may still see the store today, but the improvements are no longer present. As I reflect back during the years my parents owned the store, it was a wise decision to buy the business and expand the product line. We were able to eat well and at wholesale prices. My parents had a successful business making hot and cold sandwiches to serve the many businesses and residents in the area. There weren't many supermarkets in those days. The butchers were unionized and meat was not sold after 6 p.m. Our store was open until 9 p.m. So we got the business from the residents in the surrounding area that are coming home from work. Over the years, we were able to make a comfortable living with the military certificate of eligibility that they were able to secure a loan to invest in real estate and grow their business. San Francisco had a much smaller population then, and most residents lived and worked in the city. Owning real estate was not popular nor important to many people, but my parents felt it was better to pay a mortgage and own the building. With my father's trade school training, he was able to perform many repairs and maintenance tasks on our properties. I often accompanied Dad as his apprentice while Mom, with an employee, worked at the store after the lunch crowds have subsided. Over the years, my parents owned the business. They gradually began to reduce the hours of operation. As their time involvement in the business decreased, their commitment to the Chinese community increased. Dad had always been involved with his comrades from the 407th. He was an active member of the VFW, Veterans of Foreign War, located at Ross Alley at that time, and later became very active with AMVETS, the American Veterans Golden Gate Post number 34, where he rose through the ranks to become commander. These are some of that. Mom and Dad became increasingly more involved with the Lee Family Association. I should mention here that Lou was my father's paper son name. We are really a Lee. During the time of war, Dad was recognized as a U.S. citizen by the U.S. government when his certificate of identity was sufficient evidence. He was not a naturalized citizen until 1965, when he legally changed his surname to Lee. Mom served tirelessly with the Williams Auxiliary at the Lee Association, which supported many causes in Chinatown, and supported Dad within San Francisco's Chinatown community and beyond. In addition to serving his country and maintaining active status within the Veterans Organization, that was well respected in the Chinese community. He served as president of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, president of Hui Sun Ningyuan Benevolent Association, president and vice president of the Liandong Association, grand president of the Lee Family Association of America, president of Hui Sun High School Alumni Association, president of the board of directors of San Francisco's Lee Federal Credit Union, and commander of Ambit's Golden Gate Post number 34. At the time of his death, he was elder of the Lee Sing Yi Association, advisor to Hui Sun High School Alumni Association, and advisor to Overseas Chinese Affairs. Because of Dad was prominent with the Chinese community, he often spoke at many functions. He rubbed shoulders with many politicians, as well as because Dad was prominent with the Chinese community, he was often invited to speak at many functions. He rubbed shoulders with the local politician and was also invited to the presidential inauguration in Taiwan. As I reflect back, as I was gathering information for this presentation, I began to realize the sacrifices and contributions my parents made to make a better life for their family. I cannot understand or imagine how my father, as a teenager, traveled alone to a foreign country and started a new life where he experienced discrimination. I've come to appreciate and respect the contributions his generation made for us. With heartfelt thanks to all veterans in attendance today, thank you. You have bravely and generously served your country and leave a legacy for all of us. This is my father. He wrote the dedication to the book In the Shadow of the Tiger.
One of the questions that was asked many times about how I got into this situation about the history of our Chinese American veterans. How did I get interested in this? Well, as a kid, I didn't collect baseball cards. I didn't collect comic books. I was not interested in it. But I collected dirty old uniforms and rusty helmets, okay? And my mom thought I was crazy, all right? So, and this is true because I kind of credit this to two people. My sister, who took me to my first surplus store down on Mission Street, and I had a ball, okay? And second, my uncle, who served in Normandy. It was because of his stories that I was able to gather as a young kid. I heard him jumping out of planes, and I thought, wow, he's some kind of a Superman. But I didn't understand what a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne was about. You know, I was like, wow, this guy is kind of special. So I remember going to school, like maybe first or second grade, going to the library, and I was looking for all these books on Normandy. And I pulled them out. I remember I was looking for a picture of my uncle. But the thing is, you know, I never found any pictures of Chinese Americans, right? So as the years went on, and now I'm in high school, senior, I had the fortunate meeting to come across an old CHSA member who was Caucasian. And he was an ex-retired Army colonel named Bill Strobridge. If any of you guys were around for CHSA back in the time period, you will remember Bill Strobridge. He was one of the few non-Chinese lifelong members of CHSA. One of the meetings there was an Uncle's Cafe down here not too far, right? Uncle's was a place where all these Chinese American veterans went to congregate and tell stories and eat good Chinese American food, okay? Second place was Sunhua Q. I remember that place because my dad took me there. But Uncle's Cafe was kind of a special place because I met all these Chinese American veterans there, and these guys were incredible, from the Pacific Theater to the European Theater, people who served the 407th Air Service Squadron, Army guys, Navy guys, and I was like, wow, this is great. So I started to be really sucked into the history, and now I'm really studying World War II history. And talking to my uncle, I realized he didn't tell his story to family members much. And a lot of the family members didn't really care for him sometimes because they thought, oh, just nod your head, say yes. But I listened. I listened to his stories. And then he started to give me things, his uniform, his medals, his photos, his yearbook. Then I realized, okay, there's something really important about this. So that chance meeting with my uncle, who was attending like an Uncle's Cafe Vets meeting with his buddies, Colonel Strobridge was there. And I sat with him. He said, oh, who are you? And I started talking. So he had asked me sometime later, would you mind to work with me because I'm trying to write a book on Chinese Americans in World War II, and I'm doing this with CHSA. Unfortunately, Colonel Strobridge got sick. I believe he had Alzheimer's, and he wasn't able to do the book. And he said that there wasn't enough support or funding at that time, too. But what I did was, and this is really important, was I was the one that went around to interview the veterans for him, because I could also speak Cantonese. So I would go to the Gong Saw or somewhere to sit down and say, oh, Mr. Wong, please tell me your story. And they would say, oh, yeah, I served in the 407th Service Squadron, CBI. And then they would go into the Chinese, where obviously Strobridge wouldn't understand. So I dictated and took those notes, and I learned how to do interviews through Colonel Strobridge, okay? And I have to bring this up because a lot of credit has to go to CHSA for being the first to really look into the situation, because they did a veterans survey at that time. And I believe this was, I think it was in the 90s, I believe, early 90s. But the survey report pointed out several key factors, is that so many Chinese Americans and enlisted served in combat. Nearly 40% did not have their citizenship, correct? 17 to 18% suffered combat wounds while in theater, okay? And then, of course, 53% Chinese American veterans came home elected to use their GI Bill for school, for benefits, everything that you can think of. This is my uncle's original booklet from the end of the war, which says, as an unemployed veteran, what are my rights? Etc. Okay, so you come home, you got to get a job, right? So my uncle ended up working for the U.S. Postal Service, but he was really quiet about all the sort of his experiences because he was badly wounded. He didn't want to relive these horrors for many decades. He didn't want to say anything about this. But what was really interesting with Colonel Strobridge was, at that time, him being a military intelligence officer, he was able to dig the archives and was the first person to find the official records, and this was from 1945 June, number of selected service registrants inducted into the Army. It broke down all the Chinese here, where it shows 13,000 nearly, every state, and the largest, of course, is from California. And at that time, it showed 5,048, okay? But these records are by no means complete. That's what he found. Because what we don't have the records on today is the US Navy records, the Marine Corps records, Merchant Marines, and Coast Guard. Those records, most of the naval services were destroyed in a fire back in the 1970s, okay? And so those records are lost. So I've met many Navy vets that were Chinese. Because the Chinese, if you look back at that time, they mostly had a lot of cooks. The guys that did the laundry, they brought them on board the ship. They picked these guys up from Hong Kong, from the Philippines, Hawaii. So a lot of these guys were probably brought into service, served as contractors, but then they were also inducted into the Navy at some point. So unfortunately, we have a lot of records that are now missing. So that's why I was talking to Roger, and we were talking about the numbers of Chinese Americans. Some people had said 25,000, but I disagree that the number is very high because we only had less than 100,000 Chinese in America total at that time period. So if this record here reads 12,000 and some before 13,000, for example, there was another record that Colonel Showridge found later that it was corrected to 13,361, okay? But then what about the Navy? So that's why I use the number 15 to 20,000. That's really the right range, if that makes sense. So again, I have to give a lot of credit to Colonel Showridge for giving me that opportunity to work with him to really discover more history about our Chinese American veterans from that period. And finally, someone had said this to me recently, what the hell are you going to do with all your stuff? And my wife asks me that also, and so does my family. And I want to add that my wife is currently a United States naval officer. She's an intelligence officer, lieutenant commander. She's currently in Afghanistan. So she is serving her deployment, and she left 3 months ago. And she'll be gone into next year. And I'm home with the kids, being Mr. Mom and Mr. Dad. And don't ask me how I'm handling it, because I don't even know. Yeah, it's been a tough journey, but I just want to acknowledge your service. Thank you. The most important thing here I want to leave everyone with today is, first of all, our veteran stories are so precious. You guys are our greatest generation, just like my uncle, who's no longer with us. And without these stories, we don't have anything to go forward with. But here's the question. Now that we have some of these stories, what are we going to do with this history? How do we move forward with this? Where is this continuing education going to go? Because certainly my son, your grandkids, I don't think they know a lot about this, obviously. I don't think they teach this in school. Even World War II, yet alone, is a subject that's 2 lines, 2 sentences, and it's done. So my greatest fear is that I don't want all this history of all these men and women to be lost, because this is part of our history in America. And this is a part of our greatest generational history that will never be duplicated, can never, ever be found once again. Because if it wasn't for the World War II generation, as General Chen said, they're the forerunners of our community today. Some of the greatest individuals came as a result of the World War II service, right? So I have a heavy heart about this because I have to think, we don't have a permanent home. We don't have a museum outside of CHSA because I don't know if they can house all my junk, right? They're probably going, you're crazy, And I have so much stuff that I've collected on our Chinese American veterans going back to actually the Civil War. So I just wanted to leave today with this thought about where do we go for the future with all of this? What is going to be the end result? Because I certainly want this story and the history to be told into our future generations. I think it's supremely important that we support this somehow for the future, because without this, I think our being in America is pretty bleak, because it was Chinese in that generation during World War II that was the turning point. You start from the railroads, but once you get to World War II, that's really where the generation starts to turn, and our modern generations would start all the way from that point. Thank you for your time, everyone. Okay.
Well, we're going to wrap it up here with kind of my final story as the recipient of all these wonderful stories and the inspiration that we got from all these, the greatest generation. And where did that come from? So I was born and raised in San Francisco off of Larkin Street. And my grandfather lived at 1106 Powell, just up the road here, right? And so My parents, I recall, we went to Cumberland Press just around the corner. Most of my friends came here to Cameron House or went there. That's kind of what we did, right, back in that era. I am a product of a tiger mom and a dragon dad, right? I mean, I'm a proud product of that. But when I think back on my family's history, so my great-grandfather came over on my mother's side in the 1890s, and came over to help develop what we thought now was, the growing of America. We were talking about the railroads and everything else. On my dad's side, probably around we have the earliest documentation around the 1915. My dad's side of the family, on the other hand, though, they grew up in Grass Valley. So they're from up there in that neck of the woods, and that's probably why we say our last name incorrectly. But when I think back, though, in history, I have a couple of uncles that did serve in World War II, but they never talked about their service. I remember Uncle Jimmy, I would go into his basement and I'd look at his samurai sword there. He was a forward observer, a spotter, and he would tell me, yeah, that's what I did, but he never told me anything more. And he never let me touch the sword. He never did in all the years. It was something about it. He wouldn't let me touch it. He would never tell me stories. But I always emulated, I always wanted to be him. My dad served in the Korean War. My wife's father served in the Korean War. Impact, little side shoot. So my wife's family, her father grew up in the area. Up until about 25 years ago, we thought he was just a standard Chinese-American immigrant story. We find out later on he's actually 100% Japanese. I always wondered, why did he grow up in this area and not speak the language? I'm thinking, how does he not speak Cantonese? Well, so his father, who he thought was his father, got him from a Japanese couple, and they went off to Utah, right? And so he raised him. The war came to a completion. We found letters later on asking for him back. He said no. I mean, think about that. In that era, we don't understand too much about. He was an enemy of the state, possibly, right? And so to admit that you had housed this young man probably wasn't going to go over very well after all those years. So those are the kind of things that are impacting us when we think about our history and develops how our perceptions and things that we do. So I grew up right around here a little bit. My family did move out to the avenues later on. My dad did use the GI Bill. He had actually graduated from Berkeley at age 19, thought about joining the Air Force. We talked about it a little bit. They said he had flat toes. I don't know what flat toes are, but he miraculously got healed of his flat toes when the Korean War started, and they drafted him into the Korean the conflict there. So I'm glad in that sense. But he got to use the GI Bill. He went off to Stanford. He got his doctorate there. The dream, right, for the Tiger Mom, Dragon Dad was that I would go to Stanford and do other things. Of all the schools I applied to, that was the school I didn't get into, of course, right? And so the only schools I did get into were West Point, Naval Academy, and Air Force Academy. It was kind of interesting. So in the 70s, that's where I was headed. And I, with the kind of joke that, hey, God, let me tell you my plan. Well, he had a different plan for me. I was definitely not Stanford. So I went off to the Naval Academy thinking I was going to go be a Marine Corps officer. I wanted to be a forward observer just like Uncle Jimmy. I thought it'd be very cool to have a rifleman and a radioman run around with me, and I would just do geometry. Because, I'm Asian. I can do the geometry thing. And my Uncle Jimmy said, you missed twice, and they know where you are. And I said, I'm not going to miss. I have a hearing loss. I've always had a hearing loss. And so I had the option not to go Marine Corps at the end there. I realized I didn't want to go infantry, and so I went to the Supply Corps. I joined the Real Corps, as I always joke. James, would you agree with that? Right? The Real Corps. I joined the Real Corps, Supply Corps, thinking in the rear with the gear, not in the front with the grunts. And I thought I was going to do 5 years and get out. Well, that didn't work out so well for me, right? So in my picture, I kind of show I was an Eagle Scout right there at Cathay Post down the road in Troop 3, right? Which still exists, not real big troop anymore, but it was pretty big when I was there as a kid. Went to Lowell High School. Yeah, you either love or hate Lowell around here, isn't it? It's funny how that works. That hasn't changed. But everyone knows Lowell, though, by golly. I grew up on 15th Avenue between Ortega and Noriega. Dad was a college prof at San Francisco State University. So off I go to the Naval Academy. I actually went to West Point as an exchange student. So for those of you who watch the Army-Navy football game, right before the national anthem, they'll usually bring out 6 prisoners from each school and they exchange. I was one of those prisoners in 1981. Okay. And so I was on board 3 different ships. I was on board a submarine, the USS Narwhal, during the Cold War. I was on the USS Constellation, home ported out of San Diego, an aircraft carrier. And then in 2001 to 2003, during the Gulf War, I was the supply officer on the USS Nassau. We put 1,000 Marines ashore and brought them all home. We unfortunately left an Aviate Harrier in the water. I hear we went back and got it afterwards, but we brought the pilot home. But we brought everyone home. I guess the other thing on the top right there, I'm sitting in a chair in Al-Fawd Palace in Iraq. I always joke that I was in the front row seat of future History Channel episodes. So I did a year in Iraq, working, contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan for a year. In 2012, I went back again and I was working on distribution, bringing what we called surge recovery, bringing all the troops home, actually, and all the parts and things that we had over in the Middle East back home. The centerpiece, I guess I would tell you, of my life, and which allowed me to make this happen, of course, would be my family. So I have my wife, I have 2 kids. You can actually have a family in the military, right, Bill? It can happen. So my son, actually, we're tracking him on Find My Friends or whatever right now. He's on his way back from Japan after his 2nd tour on board a ship. We joke that he boils water for a living. He's a nuclear engineer. But he's a lieutenant in the Navy, and he's just finished his tour on the Ronald Reagan, and he's heading back this weekend for a new set of orders. Keeping the legacy going, right, of service. And the service that was kind of set forward by my uncles and my fathers and my father-in-law that taught us that sometimes we need to serve and how proud we are to be Americans. Lastly, I guess I was just going to point out one thing. You can see there's a picture of Socrates in a doctor's robe, and that's kind of the 3 philosophies that I've learned over the years from all the things I've done. One is that I've always wanted to develop in myself a servant's heart, not servant leadership. Servant leadership is about being in front, being influential, being really a servant's heart, being that you are serving others and mission first. It's not about yourself. And I always, I guess, for an example of that, and that story would be about General Meade in the Civil War. He was willing to give up his command and step down and let Grant bring Sherman from the west because it was about winning. He was going to give up his whole command. It was not about self. A bedside manner is how we lead and how we take care of our people. Think about an oncologist. Do we take care of the cancer, the patient? What are we really attacking, and do we do it with love and care? And lastly, because good answers come from everywhere, not anywhere, but everywhere, a Socratic mindset, always asking why. And so it's been the product of listening with Monty. Why is it that we have it this way? Why is it what is wrong? What's right in our history? What's wrong in our history? What do we need to make sure we carry forward? And that's what we need to do, and that's what motivates us to keep going. So thank you very much for your time. Bill, thank you for letting me speak.
So on behalf of our panel here, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Tomiko, I want to thank CHSA for organizing this. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Good job, Bill. Thank you. Good job. Good to see you. And the dancing will start right after, okay?